Welcome, everyone. This is Connections and Conversations presenting to you Walk the Talk with Karen Craggs-Milne. My name is Ramya Udaya Kumar. I'll be the host for today. Today's agenda, we will be speaking for about 45 minutes. I'll be doing opening remarks, followed by a talk by Karen. From 12:45 to 1:30, there will be a facilitated question and answer session. Just a disclaimer, this webinar will be recorded. Before we begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. From the beginning, Indigenous people have inhabited this land. We are working and living on Indigenous land. Many of us are settlers, including myself. And we're grateful for the opportunity to meet today virtually. And we thank all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years before us. We would also like to take this time to recognize that in addition to our Indigenous communities, persons who are racialized, who are living with a disability, and who have lower incomes may be most marginalized in these weeks and months ahead, while efforts are made to respond to the COVID-19 health crisis. So it is important that we as a community come together and support each other. We acknowledge the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississauga of the Credit River. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous people must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation in real and in our communities. Before we begin, I would like to discuss our discussion intentions. Can we all agree on this list, please? We agree to be present, listen actively, and respect others when they are speaking. The right to participate and the right to pass. We encourage everyone to participate to the fullest, but you also have the right to pass. No blaming. Do not blame victims for their own oppression, and let's not blame others for misinformation learned. We are also responsible for repeating information after we have learned otherwise. Mutual respect. Do not be afraid to respectfully challenge each other. In responding, remember to be hard on the issue, not the individual who is speaking, using I statements such as when I hear, I feel. Appreciate others. Instead of invalidating someone's story with your own spin on their experience, share your own story. Speak only for yourself. Speak from your own experience instead of generalizing. Assume intentions, positive intentions. Confidentiality is critical as we want to create a brave space where everyone can engage in this discussion. However, we cannot guarantee that what is shared won't be shared by others, so please protect yourself in what you choose to share. As for the image displayed here, we want to stretch, but we do not want to tear. Remember, the goal of this discussion is to gain a deeper understanding, and it is in the stretching zone of discomfort where we are able to do so. Let me introduce Connections and Conversations. We're a staff-driven initiative. We offer discussion and support for racialized staff to flourish at U of T. We create an open and empowering environment to celebrate accomplishments of our staff. We provide opportunities to contribute unique ideas and talents to the university through networking, mentoring, and other activities. Now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our facilitator. Karen is the founder and CEO of Conscious Equality Incorporated. She works globally with NGOs, corporations, and the government to develop the capacity to deliver on their equality mandates intentionally and with real impact. With over 20 years of Canadian and international experience promoting equality and inclusion, she is a leading go-to expert for organizations who are serious about getting equality work right. Karen will be facilitating the next few slides, and we will be opening the floor for discussion and engagement within the chat function. You also have the opportunity to keep your questions for the question and answer function below. Feel free to type them in and one of our moderators will moderate it and flag the questions to us. The chat function is also available for you to give any comments. If you have technical difficulties, please flag it to the panelists and we will take care of that. If you can't hear us, we can do so. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Karen.
All right, so the key question that we're answering is, what does it take? Now, I've been doing 20 years of this work globally, and that is essentially the question that people hire me to answer. What is it going to take for us to get this work right? And in the time that I've been doing this work, I've worked with 2 organizations, Plan International for 5 years, the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences for 3 years, and then with numerous organizations as a consultant. So I bring both an external perspective as well as the perspective of somebody who's working inside of an institutional framework who has to work within certain limitations. And we wanted this to be a reflective discussion. So I just want to put out there up front that I don't have all the answers. I can certainly speak to my own experience and share my own ideas, but we're looking forward to hearing from you as well. So at some points, I'll be asking if anyone wants to go, to be unmuted and come on video and, even just share your voice and talk to us about some of your own experiences. And please, think about whether you're ready or not to do that. And if you are, join the conversation. That would be awesome. So the way we're going to know if you're ready to share is for you to put a hand up when I ask a question. So if you put I think there's a high five hand up kind of sign. And if you do that, then Ramya knows that you're interested in speaking, and we'll figure out who to pick. Okay, so moving forward, let's see if I can get this to move forward. Aha. So we had 4 objectives, very short period of time. Usually my trainings are like 1 day to 5 days. And so within an hour and a half, we're going to try and cover all of this. So the first thing is to share with you a framework that I've used that really helps me, that hopefully you can learn something from. And then to engage in some reflection about our own experiences and to unpack what those are. We'll also be talking about issues that you have raised from your own experiences. So how are you experiencing discrimination? And what are some of the ways and strategies that we can provide or resources that we can share that will help you with that? So we'll see how far we get, but certainly an ambitious discussion today. I just want to remind you that as we sent out the registration, we included a thought exchange for you to add your own ideas with the very specific question, what challenges have you encountered in terms of discrimination at work based on your social identity that you want to discuss in this webinar? So you still have a chance to go back to that link. It was in the invitation that was sent out, and you can provide your input in it. And also you can rank other people's thoughts in there. Right now we have a couple, and I will be looking at those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session so I can address whatever is in there as much as we can. So I want to, as I said, we're talking about frameworks today. And so the first thing I want to do is say that there is no universal framework. There is no one way of addressing what I will call EDI frameworks or EDI work. And by EDI, I mean equity, diversity, and inclusion. And of course, inside of that, we're looking at race equity, we're looking at gender equality, we're looking at disability, we're looking at many different aspects of equality. So when it comes to institutional EDI frameworks, different organizations do it differently. And what I've realized in the work that I've been doing is that one of the reasons why this work is not sticking is because we use approaches and frameworks that are not complete. So you bring in somebody, you hire them, you create a position for them, and then you say, please fix our problem. But they don't know what is the global standard, what is best practice. They may have come from different settings and have some idea, but not necessarily one that really works. And so I'm going to share a couple of different ones with you and then speak about the one that I use and that I've developed over time. So this one here looks at policies, procedures, practices, and programs. That's one framework that you can use, and it's actually one that was referenced by the Chief Diversity Officer at Ryerson. So that's one way of doing the EDI work as a framework. Another example of an EDI framework is where you're looking at decision-making separate from practices, separate from policies and culture. So maybe looking at how is equity, diversity, and inclusion being infused in these 4 elements within the framework. Another one is to look, if you're looking at staff specifically, and say, okay, let's do EDI through recruitment, retention, professional development, and promotion. So you can see how there's all these different ways of attacking the problem. But I think, as I said before, it's so important that to get this work right, we have a comprehensive approach that really deals with the many dimensions of working in an institution. And so this is a framework that I've called the 11-point EDI framework. And I have to say that it's based on many of the different frameworks that I've worked on and used outside of my specific context. And so there's so many different ones that you can look at, and I can share links and resources to examples that have inspired me afterwards. But certainly the one key one that's really helped me put this together is the Gender Equality Framework by Interaction. And so the Interaction Framework speaks to some of these elements, not all of them. There's also, I'm having a blank right now, but there's a couple of different organizations. The ILO, for example, has an audit framework, many different ones. But let's talk about this one in particular. I'm just speaking, but let me know if anything happens and you can't follow, you can't hear me. Rami, I'll ask you to let me know. So the first element of the framework is leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I'm talking about a couple of things. One is equity, diversity, and inclusion inside of the vision and mission statements. A lot of organizations created vision and mission statements a while back when EDI wasn't even on the map. And so their mission statements, their vision statements don't reflect this commitment. And now this is something that's important, but it doesn't show up in the guiding North Star for an organization. So if you're looking at, reinventing your identity, rebranding, realigning, doing strategic planning, this is an opportunity for us to say, is this something we need to revisit to be really explicit about EDI and our commitments to it? So vision and mission statements are really important. There are organizations for whom EDI is a mandate, so that's what they do. And those organizations need to make sure that it's clearly stated and that it's stated in a way that doesn't exclude certain groups because of the language. So that's important. Additionally, leaders themselves are really important. And you have leaders who come in with a specific agenda. They're brought in as, the president of an organization or the executive director of an organization, and they have something that they're really, really passionate about. So if I think about Metrolinx, for example, and I just spoke there for International Women's Day, the CEO is 100% passionate about EDI and getting it right. And he's put resources behind it. He's shown up at events. He's talked about it. He's brought it to his conversations in other spaces. And you can tell that EDI is really much a part of who he is and how he leads. And so I think a key component to getting EDI work right is hiring and working with leaders themselves for whom this is a priority. And the last thing is top-down messaging. So as I explained with the Metrolinx example, he is sharing that message from the top down and making sure that everybody's hearing it on all levels and knowing that this is important for them. So we have a chat question for you, which Rami is going to throw in the chat there around leadership. And I would love to see what your thoughts are on EDI and when it comes to leadership and EDI. So the engagement question is EDI a priority for your organization? In terms of, remember, we're looking at leadership. So is it in the vision and mission statements? Does your leader champion it? What would you say? I'm just going to wait for a second to see what your comments are. So on paper, yes. In practice, no. Yeah. Anyone else? Depends on the leader. Very good. You have to use decentralized. I think some leaders think that EDI is. Yes. Yeah. So we're getting in some really good comments about how large organizations have multiple leaders. So it could be a departmental leader, it could be a team leader, it could be, you know, all those different ways of, different positions of leadership. And you'll find, even in a context like university, you know, some of the faculties are doing amazing. They're like, you know, especially in engineering, for example, they know this is an issue and they're spearheading and doing such a great job with women in engineering. But if you look at a different field within the same university or the same, you know, campus, it's like they don't get it, but they get it. How is this happening in the same institution? And leadership has a big role to play in that. I really like the comment about some leaders thinking that EDI is about gender parity only. Yes, I've seen that happen too. I've seen people reach out to me and say, we just want to fix the gender problem. I think part of the reality in institutions is they've got to pick one thing and get it right. And so it's a challenge to do all of it at the same time, but certainly it can be a bit frustrating when you feel like, you know, only women are getting that support or attention and others aren't. Okay, is it possible to, good question. Is it possible to see responses from other participants in the chat? I'll bring that question back to Ramya and the team. Leaders may be supportive in a superficial way, but without interest in systemic change. Fantastic. So let me speak to that for a second before we move on to the second component. So, and I teach this in my course all the time, that when we're talking about promoting equality and equity, because you can't have equality without equity, it's really important that we understand that there's levels of change within an organization, within a social context or system. And so you can have a leader who will, for example, oh, I'll give you this great example. So I was in an organization where the leader was really, okay, great, thanks, Ramya. The leader was really committed to gender equality, and we had female scientists who were really struggling because they had just had children. So they were young scientists and they wanted to travel, and one of the things that was blocking them from traveling was that they couldn't travel with their kids who were still breastfeeding and still needed care. And so while the leadership wanted gender equality and, you know, talked about how important it was for us to be inclusive and do things differently, when it came down to, okay, here's a specific person who wants to go to that conference, but she needs to be able to pay for childcare and have accommodation and everything for her children. What can we do to support her? The answer, the formal answer was, oh, well, we didn't plan this in our budget. We don't have this to make it happen. But the amazing thing was when one leader who happened to be this woman's boss, she went and talked to him and said, this is the deal. Like, you know, the organization doesn't have the funding right now. They can't make this systemic change. What can we do? Because I really want to go to this conference. And her manager took money out of his own budget, reallocated money, and made it available for her to show up. And it's really interesting because then what happened is the leadership of the organization took credit for it and said, see, we're amazing. We, you know, here we are supporting this woman scientist. But the truth is, it wasn't systemic change because it was one individual who was committed to finding a solution to one person's problem. So, you know, we have to make sure that if we're doing EDI work, especially as leaders, yes, the one-off solutions are great, but what's even more important is the systemic change, right? That we are looking at solving problems for larger groups of in the community and not just one or two people. So let me just check because I'm seeing lots of conversation on chat. Are you able to hear me and follow me? Just before I keep going. Okay, so I'm going to keep going, and I'm thanking the UFC team for helping us fix. Thank you, helping us fix the chat piece. Okay, so leadership, super important. In fact, it's one of the keys to getting this work right. Moving to the next one. Policies. So. You know, here, if anyone's here from HR, this is a really important one, policies. So when we're looking at policies, you know, a lot of people come to me and they say, we need an equality policy, we need an EDI framework, we need a gender policy, we need, but they forget that that policy has to be aligned with and in context with a number of different things. And one of them is compliance. So if we look at Ontario, for example, we want to be compliant with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. We want to be compliant with all disability-related compliance requirements, you know, the OADA Act. We want to make sure that we've got policies in place around sexual harassment, and also procedures to deal with it when it happens, equal opportunity. Now, here are policies that people don't think about, but that are so relevant to doing this work right. And those policies are what I would call secondary but supporting policies, such as maternity and parental leave, inclusive benefits. So a lot of organizations have benefits, but they define marriage as being between a man and a woman. And even though it's now become legal in certain parts of the world for, for same-sex marriages to happen, the benefit provisions don't reflect that change, right? So inclusive benefits is really important, parental leave, maternity, and of course, here I have to say that parental leave is super important because we know from research, and I did a video on this on LinkedIn, that it's so important for men to be involved with their children, especially at a young age. They need to bond, they need to take time to support their spouse who's recovering. Because by the way, I've had 3 kids and I can tell you that it's not enough to just give birth. You actually have to physically heal and mentally adjust to what's happening to you. And you need your partner's support in that. It's not like you give birth and all of a sudden you're fine, right? I should write a book on that. But the point is we need parental leave to be in place because we want men to be able to take it. Now here is where we see an example of what I call triangulation. So when you're doing EDI work, you really want to get triangulation in place. And what I mean by triangulation, for those of you who are wondering, it's to understand that it's not enough to just have a policy in place. You also have to check that that policy is being understood and accessed by people. And thirdly, that not only do they know about it, understand it, and access it, but they're able to use it and benefit from it in a meaningful way. And so if I take the example of flexible work arrangements, for example, what was so interesting in one example for an NGO that I worked with was I went in and I did an audit with them and I asked them, so you have these policies, you have the flexible work arrangements, you have the maternity parental leave, are you able to use them? And in that triangulation process, what happened was a man spoke up in a focus group and he said, you know what, we just recently had parental leave. And so I took advantage of it. I just had a child with my wife. And he said, I decided based on our policy that I can do 3 days of work a week instead of the 5, and I'll reduce my income to do the 3 days. But he said, what I've noticed is that my income is reduced to 3 days, but my work is still at 5 days. Like it's like nothing has changed. I'm now just getting paid less to do more. And I said to him, hallelujah, welcome to women's world, because that's how it is for us as women, right? And the reason why it's so difficult for us to benefit, like in a really meaningful way around flexible arrangements and policies like that, is because we internalize a lot of conversation about, oh, should I speak up? If I say anything, I'm going to lose my job. I don't want to be called the troublemaker. But because he was a man, he felt able to express what a lot of women are silent about, even though the organization has the policy, right? So it's really important that A, we have these policies in place. So that's one thing to look at if you're a part of HR. And B, that we really check, are they being used and what's in the way? Like what is stopping people? So sometimes what's stopping people is their own internalized beliefs or pressures from the community. And if you look at academics, for example, that's a really great example. I'll come to you in a second, Nashiru. So academics are a really great example because we know that female academics who are taking time off to have children and have families, it's costing them in terms of their ability to produce academic research, to have their papers published, to be cited. Like it's not just that you take a year off to go on leave, it impacts your whole career. And there are many, many ways in which this starts to show up in terms of what we call the gap, right? The gap that we're seeing. Why do women not publish more? Why are women not cited more? Well, part of it is because we have policies, but we don't see how these policies are not following through on their original intention. And we don't go to solve those problems. So for example, one way to solve it would be to say, how can we make sure that we support women so that maybe we adjust the goal for what we expect them to publish the year after they've gone on mat leave? How do we support them by changing our systems to accommodate their realities? So I'm going to stop here on policy. I saw a couple of hands and questions, and I'm just going to go to the chat and look at them. Did we ask the second question? Engagement question. Does your organization have a gender equality or EDI policy? Like in this case, it would be any policy. Okay, let's see. Nashir, would you like to speak? Can we get you get your mic unmuted so we can hear from you?
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Where are you
Yes.
participating from?
I'm actually participating from Ethiopia at the Ghana Embassy.
Oh, awesome. I'm signed up.
Great. Yeah. I was just asking this question because recently we had issues of sexual harassment being reported at the African Union. Yes, investigations were made and we haven't heard any report. People are saying the report, when it comes out, it will put people in problems and all those. So that's why I'm asking, how do we make sure that people are protected even if they report issues of such cases in an institution?
Yes.
Thank you.
So thank you for your question. This is really a really complex one. And just for you to know, this is a major issue here in Canada as well. In fact, there is a particular organization that I am aware of that was brought to my attention that has been doing really good work for 20 years on the outside, but on the inside, their staff have been complaining of sexual harassment, inappropriate behavior, bullying, and it's led to mental health issues. It's led to, you know, people losing jobs, all kinds of things. But the people who've been accused of maintaining and kind of turning an eye on all of this have not been held accountable. And so, you know, let's talk a little bit about that. I'd love to hear from participants as well. How can we make sure that people feel safe enough to report, but they are also feeling safe enough that their own privacy is not at stake? I mean, there are certain provisions. So here in Canada, if you're doing this work right around sexual harassment, you will protect the privacy of the individuals who are coming forward. It's also against the law here in Canada to retaliate against somebody who reports. So if I report, let's say I report and then there's an investigation and then they say, actually your claim was not, your claim was, you know, not found to be sexual harassment. There are still people who will turn around and retaliate against the individual who complained, you know? So it's a very complicated, difficult situation. And at the end of the day, it comes down to having strong accountability and having a strong commitment. And while the AU has this report out, it's really important that they call out people and that they keep people accountable for things that they've done. And at the same time that they protect individuals, because those individuals should not be named. They should not be exposed to the public. You know, their identity should not be revealed, right? Like the only people who need to know who is it that made the claim and who is it that that says something happened should be the people investigating and the people making decisions about what's going to happen, and the individual who's being accused, right? So here in Canada, I think we're doing a better job of kind of respecting the privacy of individuals. We call them Jane Doe. We've had a few situations where Jane Doe has, and Jane Doe is just a name. You could, you know, say Mary Jane, but like under an anonymous name, they have talked about things that have happened, and we've maintained their privacy because we understand the backlash from society once people know about who you are. It's a very complicated question. The last thing I want to say around sexual harassment, since it's under HR, is that I have worked with a lot of people who've been accused of sexual harassment because they did something or because they didn't know that what they were doing would constitute as sexual harassment. So it could be partly ignorance, but very often it's intentional harassment of individuals. And so here's something really important for you to understand as somebody who may not know this, but there is such a thing as poisoned environment. So for poisoned environment, you don't have to touch me physically. You don't have to make comments to me physically. It could simply be that you send a cartoon that's really inappropriate to me or to my friend, and my friend shows it to me. And you've now made me feel uncomfortable because you have brought into the workplace something that is inappropriate, something that makes me feel like I'm no longer in a safe workspace. That is enough for me to say that you have caused a poisoned work environment, and therefore I can put down a report against you on sexual harassment. So I just want to be clear that there's two types of harassment: quid pro quo and toxic workplace, right? And toxic workplace is not direct. It's not about physical contact. It's about everything that you do or say intentionally or unintentionally that poisons the environment for a specific individual or for others who are part of that environment. And, you know, I feel like we don't do enough education for people to understand that, because if they did, they would stop circulating inappropriate jokes. They would stop talking about their neighbor's wife. They would stop doing all the stuff we do thinking that, oh, this isn't sexual harassment. Well, under the law, it is sexual harassment if somebody feels like it's impacting their ability to work and be productive and feel respected in that space. So I don't know if that was a helpful digression there, but I thought that that was really important. And I'm seeing tons of comments. So can you just give me a second to digest? Slides aren't advancing. Okay. Yes, you can get copies of slides after. We'll make that available. Okay, so where are we now? I have so much to say. Okay. I see a new message. Sorry, there's just so many messages. I want to get to the more recent ones. Okay, so where were we on policy? So somebody said there's a policy, but it's very general. It does not include indicators, and we do not report on it. Okay, so here's the thing. Policies don't have indicators, but a policy in itself is not enough. Hi, Marie Ellen. It's not enough. So you have to have a policy, and along with a policy, you have to have a strategy, you have to have an action plan, and you have to have a measurement framework with indicators. So if you only have a policy in place, you have work to do. So that's really important for people to know. Can you share a measuring framework? It's easier to measure and evaluate diversity. How about inclusion? How do we approach intersectionality? How do we capture many layers of identity factors? So good, Jermaine. Those are really important questions. And what I would say is let's start with, you know, clarifying diversity and inclusion and intersectionality for everybody. So we know that diversity is about numbers and, you know, the richness inside of the numbers. So do we have only white people? Do we have only women? Do we have only older people? Right? So, you know, diversity is, the goal of diversity is to bring in different kinds and groups of people through hiring practices, through promotions, etc. So just having lots of different kinds of people in the same space. But we know that that can go one of two ways. It can either create more division and more friction because of the differences and styles of thinking, working, all of that, or it can create a much richer context in which better solutions, better decisions are being made, and there's more creativity and innovation. So that's the key argument for diversity and inclusion, is it leads to innovation, it leads to better decision making. But inclusion, so let me put it this way, the strategies that you use to do diversity work are different from the strategies that you use to do inclusion work. Because inclusion and belonging is not about having more and more different people. It's about creating a space of belonging. It's about helping people feel when they walk in the door like they matter, like their unique and different and quirky ways of being are equally valid, that there is not a certain box they need to fit into in order to belong in a particular organization or space, right? And so inside of that, when you say, how do we approach intersectionality? Intersectionality, this is really important. So let me talk about intersectionality and then come back to the other comments. So intersectionality is really important because people understand it or misunderstand it to mean, you know, like if you take me, for example, I'm a woman, I'm a person of color, I'm a mother, I'm able-bodied, like, you know, I'm of mixed race because my mother is Indian, my father is English, I was born in Africa, like, so they take these markers of identity and they say that's intersectionality. So one way of looking at intersectionality would be to say, you know, let's change the way we collect data from an EDI perspective, and instead of just looking at how many, because a lot of organizations only say we have 7,000 employees. But if you ask them how many of these employees are women, they don't know. How many of these employees are young people under 30? They don't know. So one way to do this work, the very basic way to do this work around adding an intersectional lens to EDI work, in data at least, is to say, let's start measuring along different lines. Let's break the data down so you're getting more and more information, right? So you would start asking people, as you're collecting data on who you're hiring or who's staying at the end of the year, you would say how many men, how many women, of what different age groups, you know, orientation, different ethnicities, specific needs in terms of ability, et cetera, so that you get a richer picture of who you have in the organization. But collecting data from an intersectional perspective does not, in and of itself, lead to inclusion, which is where people fall down. Because then they say, well, we have the data, but now what? And so what I would say around inclusion, this is now a separate question from measuring, but inclusion is super, super important because it's about how we treat each other. And an organization, I've walked into organizations that have had amazing policies and they're completely toxic and they make people feel awful. And I've had staff say to me, I don't feel safe. I cannot share my opinion openly. I'm not allowed to be who I am. And in that space, it's like all your policies failed because the leader or something massive happened in the organization that has shut people down, that has created distrust, that has created a sense of grievances that are not being heard. That's another big one in terms of inclusion. So let me just say that because I should move on. I think when we're looking at meaningful inclusion, we must create spaces. If nothing else, we must start creating spaces for people to have honest conversations about what is bothering them, about what is not working, about what needs to change. And so we have policies, and I've said this before, we have policies made in an office by an expert. Maybe you bring in a consultant like me to make your policy, or you have your EDI office make the policy. Those policies mean nothing if people, in their day-to-day experience of your organization feel silenced. And so really, really important, if nothing else, to do an intersectional approach to inclusion, you need to create safe spaces for people to be able to honestly speak up about what they feel needs to change. And here's the thing, everybody, you need to listen to them and do something about what they talk about. Because I've been brought into organizations where people will say, yes, let's have a focus group, let's listen. And then the management doesn't want to do anything about what they say. So if there's a perception, for example, that the last 3 people that were promoted to senior positions were all white people, and we create space for this conversation to happen, and everybody questions how that happened when they were equally qualified people of different backgrounds that weren't brought up, that nobody's been promoted in the last 12 months who was not white and didn't fit a certain group. Management has to be willing to hear that and do something about it. If you're not, then you're not contributing to inclusion. And so again, that really ties back to leadership and commitment to walk the talk, which not everybody is ready for. So sometimes I actually go into organizations and I meet everybody and then I say, you're not ready. You're not ready to do this work. So I'm not going to be part of it. Because the last thing I want to do is window dress, what's going on in people's lives, right? Okay, I feel like I spent a lot of time on policies. So let me just say, several comments in the chat. Yes, more slides to go, lots more. So why don't we do this? Let me get through the slides and then we'll have time for chat, right? Let's do that. Okay. So human resources we talked about. Okay, human resources. So human resources is 3 of 11. So I've got a lot to cover. Here we're talking about recruitment, retention, promotion, and really important, we're looking at where do you go to advertise, what language do you use in your job descriptions, what kind of person are you looking to hire, because when you have 100 resumes, you look through all of them and the person who's looking has a certain filter. So what is that filter? What are the biases that they're bringing to how they pick who is going to end up being interviewed? And then within hiring committees, super important. This is how I changed what happened at Plan International in Canada. Within 3 years, I positioned them as a leader by doing one thing. And that thing was to make sure that every time they hired anybody, whether it was a finance person or it was, an operational support person, we asked them gender equality questions. Why? Because we were going to be a leading gender equality organization. So if nothing else, the one thing you want to start doing as you're hiring people is start asking them questions about EDI. What is your perspective? Have you done training? Give us an example of how you've applied EDI principles in your role, whatever that role was, finance, budgeting, anything, project management. And start filtering out people who don't already get this, because if they don't get it, trying to train them up afterwards is really difficult. But when you hire a finance person who gets it, you don't have that fight on your hands anymore. And all of a sudden, things start to shift when you have more and more people coming into the organization who believe in this work already. The other thing that we found when I was working in St. Lucia recently with the government there to mainstream gender equality across their ministries, they had no job descriptions that included clear responsibilities and performance reviews for gender. So super important. It's not enough to have, you know, EDI, an office over there, and one individual. It's like, what is the role of the CEO in EDI? What is the role of the VPs? What is the role of the department heads? Is it in their job descriptions? Because I can tell you at the end of the year, if it's not in the job descriptions and they're not being reviewed on it, they're not going to do anything on it. They only follow up on what's in the job description first. So a good way to institutionalize it is make sure it's in there for everybody, not just the EDI people. And last thing here I want to talk about is conflict resolution and exit interviews. If your organization is not currently doing exit interviews, you are really dropping the ball, because exit interviews tell you, that is when people are the most honest, and they tell you what it is that pushed them out the door. And often what pushed them out the door is things that are, you know, unconscious bias, or somebody who was harassing them on an ongoing basis, or feeling like they were never supported and promoted and growing. These are the real people issues that we need to start dealing with to get EDI work right. So I'm just going to go through these slides, and then hopefully we have time for Q&A after. Okay. If any of the team want to jump on and say something to me, they just jump on and speak, okay? So finance, really, really important. And what my message here around finance is, you need different types of budgeting around EDI work. So one EDI budget that you need is, you know, if you have an EDI office, that office needs a budget. If you have an EDI person, like an officer, that person needs their own budget. And that budget needs to be separate from everything else, and they need to control the budget line. So, you know, when I was working in Brazil, we were in a project, there was a budget available, it was separate. After much arguing, it was separate. But then that person had to ask permission from a different manager to be able to use the budget the way it needed to be used. And it just creates so much inefficiency and conflict and power struggles. And so I would say EDI work needs its own budget, and that budget should include budget for training, budget for operationalizing all activities. For example, International Women's Day events on campus, where's the money coming to do that right? Okay, and we often go into budgeting without thinking about needing money for the activities that we end up doing, and then they don't go so well. And also, you know, the other thing I wanted to say is all departments should have EDI embedded in their budgets. So it's not enough to have a separate budget over there. Everything that you do, any specific programs or services that you're developing should have EDI lines inside those budgets for developing that out, so that you are doing the additional pieces that you need around that. Okay, I'm seeing comments. I'm just gonna have a quick look at the comments and then keep moving. Okay, yeah, we've got the question up there. I don't know if we're gonna have time. What do you think, Ramya? Should I just keep talking? Okay, so yeah, I should keep talking, but let me just go to this question. Is it also fair to ask the same question to an employer? What is your policy on diversity? Maybe during an interview. Yes, you should. And by the way, I was at a session where somebody was helping answer the question, what do you say to an interviewee when they ask you, what's your EDI policy? And you have nothing to show for it. So people are actually coaching employers on how do you answer that question so you don't look like a total loser as an organization, which just made me laugh. Because then I'm like, you need to talk to me and actually put something meaningful in place, not pretend like you need to get out of it. Okay, when you badly need a job, maybe you'll stay away from such questions? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Because here's what happens. When you go into an organization and you think of it in terms of, I just need this job, I will work everything out later. What happens is you get hired into a context that doesn't value you, that doesn't promote you, that doesn't see you for everything that you are. And then you're like, I hate this. I hate this experience. I hate this job, you know, but you walked into it willingly because you didn't ask the questions that, see, the thing is, we are not the ones being chosen by interviewers. We are choosing organizations that we want to work with. And so you need to flip it around, because people want smart people, but they also want people who have values that align with them. And so do we, right? So I would say flip that around. And if you want coaching on that, talk to me afterwards. Okay, let me go back. Finance, finance, okay. Staffing, okay. So here, in gender terms, we talk about gender balance. So I want to make one point about staffing, and then I'm going to move on. I can tell a lot about an organization just by looking at their organizational chart. When I look at that organizational chart and I start looking at it in terms of where's the gender breakdown from board all the way down to the front lines, down to the you know, who's the receptionist and who's cleaning the offices. When I look at that breakdown in terms of gender, in terms of race, in terms of age, in terms of ability, I can tell you a lot about the state of that organization. Because here's the thing people don't understand. Organizations look the way they look on purpose. You know, at best, by accident, they think, you know, we say, oh, we weren't planning to have all white male board members, but the truth is you've noticed it and you've done nothing about it. And that's not an accident. So it may be that you're not ready, that you don't have the right direction, that you're fearing. There's all kinds of reasons why. But when an organization looks a certain way, it looks a certain way because there's certain values at play that are being reproduced. And so it's a really great place to start. And I often talk about doing a baseline measure for organizations, because where do they start? Do they just keep throwing training at staff? Do they start hiring people of color? Like, where do you start? And I always say, start with the data. Start with the data. And this is really important. Look at what is the composition of your organization and ask questions around why does it look so great in this department or this faculty and not look so great over here? And then unpack what's going on there that needs to change. So that's my comment on staffing in marketing and comms. So I don't know about you, but I rarely hear about how EDI needs to be connected to marketing and comms. And this is so important because marketing and comms is all about your identity, your internal identity and your external identity. And communications teams and marketing teams have a lot of power in influencing the messaging that we are consuming as staff members of an organization, as well as what the world is seeing and hearing about us, right? So I'm going to come to the chat in a second. But what do I mean when I'm talking about marketing and communications? I'm talking about the website. So I've been to websites of organizations that don't talk at all about their EDI components or commitments, that don't have their policies on the web page, that don't have any pictures of people of, you know, different backgrounds. You know, I've had organizations give me pamphlets and it was all white people. And it's like, well, we want to have more women of color coming to our programming, but everything that you put on your annual report, on your brochures, on your application forms, on your website, none of the images reflect a commitment to diversity and inclusion. So super important that we get this work right. And it's not just about images, it's also about where you're posting, who you're posting to, and how your message changes when you have an EDI lens to it. So I'm gonna stop there and see, oops, screen sharing stopped. I just wanna see what some of the comments are, and maybe I can do this again. Let's go to this one, which was anonymous. As much as confidentiality and privacy is said to be guaranteed, each organization or department has their own exception to that rule, hence why a lot of folks do not like coming forward. It is believed that higher ups or senior admins are in cahoots, and therefore, because of power differentials, yeah, it never feels safe. Okay, so I'm going to say this based on, I'm just going to address that comment and then I'm going to go back to the slides. So when I first moved into working with organizations, I always thought that that the function of HR was to support the employee. I learned the hard way, and I'm speaking about my own experience. I'm not saying this is the case for everybody, but I learned the hard way that HR's objective is not to protect you, the employee. HR's objective, in practice, in most organizations, is to protect senior management and the organization's image and culture and reputation. So if you come forward with something, or you know, you've become branded as the troublemaker, often what happens is they're going to protect senior management and the organization over you. So anyone who hasn't figured that out yet, wake up call, right? Like, don't expect that HR is there for you. They're not necessarily there for you. I would say, I'm not saying nobody's there for you, but often they're not. And so I can totally understand and relate to that comment that, you know, the perception being that, you know, like, who do I go to? Who is fighting for me? Like, where is my voice heard? And I think at the end of the day, this is where external accountability. So in many cases, in one organization, an external ombudsman was introduced because the number of complaints were so high about how every time we've gone to HR, they didn't listen. Every time we went to our manager, they didn't listen. Every time the last CEO didn't do anything about it. So when a new CEO came in, this was the time where they wanted to get things right. And so that CEO said, there's just so many complaints I'm hearing from everybody that we need to fix this. And they came up with a solution to have an external ombudsman who is completely independent from all the politics and all the relationships that are happening internally at senior management and across HR and everything, and who would objectively investigate complaints. So when there's a change, a major change, like a change in leadership, that's a really good time to organize and to share your perspective about what hasn't worked and what you'd like to see. And for organizations who want to get this right, look into an external ombudsman as an option for dealing with these issues objectively. And I saw a question here about, so how do you define or understand the role of equity offices that are internal to organizations? So what I would say is that an equity office, and please, Jody, you know, like, let me know if it's different from your perspective. But for me, an equity office is almost like a programming office. They're doing programming for the community. They're doing programming for maybe staff members. They're, you know, out there organizing events. You know, they're creating safe conversations and spaces, but they don't have the ability to hold somebody accountable. They don't have, you know, they don't have the teeth that HR would have, and that's the problem. So one of the things that I've said, and I've learned from my own experience, I will not go into an organization where I don't have teeth in my role, because I know from 20 years of experience, I know what I'm doing. And if I'm going to be put in a position that's so far down that I'm not reporting high enough, that I have no teeth, that I can't hold people accountable, then all you're asking me to do is programming work. You're not asking me to deal with the real issues. And I think that, you know, that's one of the limitations. Is this is why organizations are starting to have chief diversity officers that report directly to the executive director, where they're not entangled in any kind of struggle around HR, trying to protect staff, or in the politics of senior management or all of that. So I'm going to stop there. I'm sure we could have a really rich discussion on any of these topics, but I do want to make sure I get through the 11 points. Okay, so marketing, we talked about that, right? So if nothing else, if you're from marketing or you want to take something back to your team, you know, sit down with your marketing team and say, let's just look at what we have. Forget being an expert. You don't have to be an expert. Just sit down with your marketing team and say, let's look at the website. What is the website telling us? If you're a person of color, if you're a person with a disability, if you're an Indigenous individual, what are our communications tools telling us about EDI and our commitment? And if there's a lot of gaps there, it's a really great way to go through an internal exercise to align more effectively, right? Okay, so we've talked a little bit about this already. I'm going to bring that up. Organizational culture. Here we're talking about the core value. Oh, okay, so this is really important. So I went into an organization and I was trying to find, you know, the triangulated way of understanding. So people will say one thing when actually there's something else going on. And this happens all the time when I'm doing these kinds of exercises. So one of the questions that I asked that was like really enlightening was I asked everybody, what are the top 3 qualities of an ideal employee in your organization? So you think, well, that's not a question about EDI or anything, like, you know, what has that got to do with EDI? But I asked them, what are the top 3 qualities of an employee? Like, just everybody. And there was a theme that started to come up. And the theme was, we get underpaid and we don't complain about it. We work long hours. So we, you know, the first one's here, we're the last one's leaving. We're working on the weekend. We're working all the time. And we don't complain. So we get underpaid, we work a lot, and we don't complain, okay? And so that was what had been ingrained into everybody's mind. So management had been encouraging people to be this kind of ideal employee. And I'm laughing because I'm just thinking about that conversation. And at the same time, when I looked at the issues that were coming up from an EDI perspective, like what were some of the things I was seeing, the red flags that were going up? So one was that this organization had a split gender difference. So there were 70% women, 30% men. And when you looked at how many of them were parents with young kids, like more than 60% of the women were parents with young kids. They had men who were parents with young kids. And there was a high turnover. People were really frustrated and angry. They were very bitter. There was just like negative everywhere. And I was trying to figure out what is going on. And then I put a few things together, and what I realized was people didn't understand that they had a certain demographic of employees who needed more flexibility because of their multiple roles as parents, as caregivers, etc. And I'm seeing this play out now in COVID, by the way, as well. And so people would reach a point after they've become bitter, they're angry, they don't feel valued, they feel like you never promote them, you know, all of this stuff. They would start looking for other work, and eventually they would find other work and leave. So their rate of people leaving was really, really high. And they hadn't connected that to the values that they had been expecting people to internalize, right? Because you cannot do all those things and still have a life and work-life balance and take care of your kids. There's going to be burnout, there's going to be mental health issues, etc., etc. So, you know, think about this and have this conversation with your team. What does an ideal employee or an ideal student look like? And what are we implying inside of our internalized perspective of what that ideal person is? Because there's so much hidden and implied inside of that, inside of those values, right? Okay, also perceived commitment to EDI. I want to go down to day-to-day interactions, supporting diverse ways of working and thinking. So that's really important. That, you know, there was one organization that I went into where someone said, this lady said, I close my door. I have an office, and when I work, I close my door. Because when I close my door, I can focus. But the men in the office think that I'm being rude and that I'm somehow being unproductive because I close my door. Because to them, it means I'm rejecting them. I don't want connection with them. I don't want to talk to them. But she said, if my door is open, they see it as an invitation to just come and interrupt me anytime and to just sit and talk about the baseball game or the hockey game. And she said, I cannot work. I'm not productive. So, you know, diverse ways of working and thinking. When we're talking about EDI, we're not just talking about the skin color or, you know, whether or not you can walk or talk, right? Like, we're talking about diverse ways of working and thinking. And do people feel available and able to come up and show up the way they are? I had a person who sold their home, moved to this country with their kid and their husband for a job that they had been accepted for. And within 3 months, they were so traumatized, like so traumatized, their whole life was ruined because they would come to work wearing ethnic clothes, which is what they've been doing for, you know, 30 years in their own country. They would come to work wearing ethnic clothes, dealing with everything that you deal with, setting up a home, finding your kid to school, everything, during a time where we had massive deadlines, we had a lot of work. And what they were told was, you need to stop showing up at work like that. You don't belong here because you're not dressing like us. This isn't your home country. You need to come and show up, go buy clothes and show up like the rest of us. And I was that person's manager, and it was someone above me that told this person that, you know, you're having a really rough start and you're not helping yourself. And I started to see signs that she felt like she was down a lot. She was like avoiding conversation. She was not happy. And so I went up to her and I said, what's like, I'm seeing a change here. What's changing? What can I support you with? What's going on? And eventually she told me, she didn't want to tell me because this was a higher person, but when she told me that she was told to go buy Western clothes so that she could fit in, I was so furious. First of all, I told her that that has nothing to do with your ability to do your job. And if you need to hear it from me as a manager, I'm telling you, you can show up wearing anything you want. I don't care because what matters is your work. And then I said, thirdly, I'm going to go address this with this person because as a leader, they're sending the wrong message, right? So there's so many ways in which we create inclusive, safe spaces for people to feel that they can be who they are, and so many ways in which we don't allow that to happen. And in corporate Canada right now, the biggest issue around organizational culture is parents who have kids. And they're, you know, the organizations have sent them home during COVID and they're like, oh, you know, yeah, we want everybody to be together. So we're going to have 9 o'clock video calls and we're going to have Zoom lunches where you have your video on for Zoom lunch. And we're going to have 5 o'clock drinks to make sure that everybody's happy. So you're on Zoom with your glass of whatever it is. But if you're a parent with kids, you don't want to be on camera. You're trying to help your kids study. You've got people running around. It's a mess. So right now, working parents are really struggling with it, and they're feeling that conflict of like, oh my gosh, like my organization doesn't understand my day-to-day reality. Like I want to scream at somebody, you know, But here's the thing. So someone asked me, what can I do about it? And I said, you need to have an honest conversation with your manager. And if it's an organizational issue, all parents need to come together and talk about it. And this is really important. I want to say this before, in case I run out of time for the call. So when we do EDI work, it's really important that those of us who experience othering, I'm just going to put it that way, that we understand that we have a responsibility to find and provide solutions. I'm not saying it's all on us, because people will say it always comes down to us. They never do the work to figure it out. They always put it on us. But one thing that has helped me be really successful in a very, I don't want to say white space, but in a space that doesn't look like me and sound like me, one thing that has helped me be really successful is that when I have a problem, I come to the table with not only the problem, but also one or two solutions. And so that is key to doing EDI work right, is that we want to partner with people. The tone needs to be partnership and not, this is your fault and what are you going to do about it, right? Really, really important. Okay, so where are we at? So we can talk more about organizational culture, but at the end of the day, an organization's reputation is huge. So changing reputation once it's out there is really, really difficult. And it's actually a really valid point to say to leadership and people who support you need that, you know what, like what's at stake here is our reputation. Because if you have a couple of employees who leave and we talk about what a terrible experience it was here, we're not going to get the kind of traction we want. And actually, I want to give you this example because it's so important. So I went into an organization and talked to the leadership, and I asked them, so what are your priorities? And they said, well, we don't have enough people of color. We want more people, and specifically from the Black community, where we don't have enough people from the Black community here. And I said, okay, interesting. So the strategy that we would use to do that would be X, Y, and Z. But then I said, I need to talk to the staff. So I talked to staff and I talked to people who are already there from the Black community. And I said, what is your experience working here? How do you feel about this organization? Would you promote it? Would you recommend it to your own friends and family? And they said, no way. So the reason why they said no way was because the same management that were saying, go get more people of color, were the same management who were confusing two different people and be like, hey, John. And it's like, I'm not John, I'm Richard. So it's like, you got to get that stuff right. It's so important to get that stuff right. Organizational culture. Okay, good question. So there was a question here, which maybe I can come to it afterwards, about resistance. Okay, so let's come back to resistance. Okay, organizational culture. Okay, expertise. Let's talk about expertise. So the biggest thing that organizations do wrong around expertise is they will hire one person to do EDI. Like I know somebody who was on this call who is doing EDI for 7,000 people. And it's one person. And they're not even like a person who has teeth or who can make decisions. So that's one thing that we do wrong, is that we set people up to fail because we don't resource them adequately and we don't include enough support for them. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, when we're looking at expertise, we don't just want to hire one expert or one team of experts. Like I know in University of Toronto, for example, they have different equity offices and different supports, which is really awesome. But we also want to make sure that we are training everybody and upskilling everybody on EDI all the time. And that's not something that you can do without budget. That's not something that you can do as a last minute thing. So how do we go about supporting a culture of learning? And at Plan, I did two things. Every new member that came into the organization went through an orientation training with me specifically, not with my support staff. So they had training from the leader of the team, and I answered their questions, I pointed out resources, I developed relationships with them right away. So orientation was super important, and ongoing development was also really important. And we don't budget for it, so we're not able to do it, right? So one of the things that we want to talk about maybe at the Q&A time is, what does supporting development of equity look like, EDI look like right now? So what is question, okay, we'll come to that question later, but like, you know, is your organization doing more than just making one person responsible for so much work? And by the way, if you are in that position where you're one person responsible for 8,000 people, or even one person responsible for 40, let me just make something really simple and clear for you. It's not a job you can do. Certainly not a job you can do well. And so that's something I want managers to hear. If you're managing people and you have people on your team, you need to understand that you have to support them and give them the resources. If not, you're setting them up to fail. And who wants to fail, right? And if they do, then you should take responsibility for that. Okay, let's move on. We've got three more, and then we can do Q&A. Institutional supports. So this is super important. A lot of organizations have somebody doing EDI on the side of a full-time job. So maybe they're an accountant, maybe they're doing programming, maybe they're the HR person, and EDI is something they do on the side of their jobs. But what's really important if you want to do this work right is that you have to have institutional supports in place. So what do I mean by that? So you have to have the policy framework, the policy and strategy action plan. You have to have the budget for it. You have to have, if you have an EDI office, the EDI office has to be independent of all other offices, reporting to the CEO or the leader, really important to make sure that they have the teeth to be objective and to call things out as they need to. You know, very few Fortune 500 companies, I think less than 30% have full-time dedicated EDI staff. So if a Fortune 500 company isn't getting it right, you can see that, you know, on one way, it's not a bad thing because at least we can be happy if we have that right. And on another way of looking at it, it's like we have a lot of work to do, right? Okay, the other things that you can have in terms of institutional support are cross-departmental working groups, really important, or what I call focal points. So when I was working with the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, I was the EDI person, there was only me. And yes, I had a direct line to leadership, which was awesome. But it was such a dispersed organization, I couldn't expect myself to do meaningful work on the ground across 6 countries in Africa by myself. So what I did is I created focal points who had roles with job descriptions and goals that their managers signed on to. And those individuals had, at first it was partial, and in some cases we moved to full-time roles now. You know, they had a responsibility to take their team or their department, or in this case, their country office, to take the frameworks that I was developing, the training that I was showing them, the stuff that we were doing centrally, and to roll it out. And so, like, if I look at UFT, I know that there's a lot of teams, there's a couple of teams that are working at the campus level, which would be, you know, that same structure, right? So they're taking what's happening centrally and they're diffusing it out to the community in different and meaningful ways. So that's really important. The other one is affinity groups, like the one that we're hosted by today. You know, it's really important that we create affinity groups. But here's the thing about affinity groups that I want to share in terms of my observation. So companies are doing this too. So when I was working with CIBC, they had a Latino group, they had an accessibility group, they had, you know, all kinds of different groups, right? While it's great that we create spaces for us to connect with other people who are having similar experiences, we cannot rely on that to solve problems, because what tends to happen is we break off into these spaces, we speak openly about our issues, and then we don't take them back in a constructive way, right? And, you know, if you think about it, who is it that needs the education? Who is it that needs to know about the stuff that we talk about inside the closed room? It's our leaders. It's our managers. It's the general population that don't get us. And so while affinity groups are really important, we also need space and ways to meaningfully have conversations, dialogue, and engagement with the rest of the community. And we don't do enough of that. So it's like, we assume that if you go to work and you're going about doing your day-to-day thing, that's enough interaction. But we need more purposeful opportunities to engage on these conversations. Because what happens if you only rely on affinity groups, we don't get that information out. We don't share, we don't educate, we don't create partnerships and bridges and relationships with people around this stuff in particular. So I'm not just talking about, let's go for lunch for sushi, I'm talking, let's talk about, you know, what it's like to be a racialized person in this organization right now and how this decision that you made has impacted us, right? That's what I'm talking about. So I just want to answer the question that Leila was asking. How important is it to have job descriptions for EDI work that have an essential requirement that you have to have EDI work experience engagement? Hell yes. Do not put somebody in an EDI role that does not have that experience. And government is very guilty of this. I have to say, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people being moved into EDI roles in government, gender-based analysis roles, gender equality officer roles. They have no training. They don't know what they're doing. They don't even have a say about whether or not they were transferred to that department. And this is a need that I started to see that I met through my own training. So I train people who are in these roles who don't know what it looks like to do it right. And so if you're in that space, contact me afterwards. If you want more support understanding what that role involves and how to do it and what are the tools and guidelines and skills, contact me afterwards. But yes, we should not be hiring people who, or let me put it this way, let me be more compassionate. We should not be putting people in positions to do jobs that they don't know how to do, that has a lot at stake and that makes them feel like they're burdened, they're not supported, and they're going to fail. Let me put it that way. So do we have anyone off the mic or should I keep going? Oh no. It says I'm paused. Did you hear any of what I just said? I'm not sure. Okay. Okay, all right. You heard me. Okay, good. So let me finish the slide since I didn't hear anyone, and then let's do some chat. Programs and services. Okay. So what do I mean by programs and services? I am talking about, so if you're in a university context, for example, what I'm talking about is things like food banks, things like counseling for students, things like career advice, like all of those would be considered programs and services for your stakeholders. In a university context, those are your students, right? But you also have programs and services that you offer staff, so, and faculty, excuse me. And if you are an organization like an NGO, your programs and services are things like when you design programming. So I've done a lot of design for international development programs, like creating healthcare systems, creating educational programs, creating employment, microfinance, all of those different kinds of initiatives that you're doing. You have to make sure that EDI is embedded in all of them. So it's not enough, my key message here is, it's not enough to have EDI specific programming only. You have to be able to, every time you're introducing a new service or a new program, or you've even got existing ones, you have to be able to audit them to see what can we do to make sure that it's inclusive, that it's addressing the unique needs, and it's also removing the specific barriers that certain groups face in relation to this specific program or this specific service. So reviewing programs and services and getting them to be more inclusive and more meaningfully available to different groups of people, that is real work. And that work needs to happen above and beyond the EDI specific work, like training people, developing capacity, engaging them on International Women's Day, engaging them on international, celebrating people with different abilities, all of that, right? So what I find is a lot of EDI offices get stuck on that stuff and they never get to actually do the institutional work that needs to happen. And my message is we need to do both. We really need to do both. And a key entry point for doing that work right is the needs assessment and community input right at the design stage, So I'll give you a quick example of that because there's really, I would say there's 4 levels of doing this work right. And I won't go into all 4, but what I want to say is a quick example. So there was an office space that was coming up, the lease was coming up, and the managers needed to decide, are they staying or are they going somewhere else? And what they didn't like about this office space was that in the bathroom, the tap was constantly leaking. This is actually it's in Ethiopia, in Africa. So the tap kept leaking, the guys didn't like it, and the men were managers, and so they said, you know what, we have this much money, let's just find a better office with a better, setup, the plumbing's working, it's a nice space. And so to get a nice office that had all the requirements that the managers wanted, they had to move further out of Addis. And so when they moved further out of Addis, their money went further and they could get a nicer, newer building, okay? So when I went in and spoke to them, they said, we're really happy, we love working here, we've just moved offices, it's fantastic. And then when I talked to the women and I said, how is your experience working here? They said, well, you know what?
it's actually gotten worse. I'm actively looking for a job somewhere else. And the reason is because now they've changed offices. It takes me longer to commute to work. I'm always worried about my safety. When the sun goes down, I need to get back home. I'm constantly struggling to like find people to get my kids from school on time because I can't get back. Like all of these concerns that were created because the managers moved to an office without considering everybody's input. If they had asked everybody, what do you need before we make this decision, they would have found out that the women need to be closer, the women need to, that safety was an issue, and that it wasn't just about running toilets. So you see how designing from the beginning with stakeholder input is so important, and that matters for everything that we're talking about, not just buildings, not just rent. I'm talking about, you know, even right now, the government is giving out all of these, what are they called, subsidies and supports for people who are being impacted by COVID. And one of the groups that was identified by all of the people working on women's issues is people who are experiencing violence. How do we deal with that? If you're going to give support, how do we support meaningfully specific groups who are disadvantaged or who are at risk? But this needs to be part of everything that we do, not just the EDI's office, right? Okay, last one, and then we can chat. So here I want to talk about partners, vendors, and suppliers. So when we do EDI work, there's an internal ecosystem that we're working with. So from HR to leadership to finance to marketing, all the different departments. But there's also additional pieces that are super important and that feed into our framework and that can either support us actively or can undermine what we're doing. And so these are three groups that are really important. One is partners. So who are you partnering with? Are you partnering with EDI specialists? Are you partnering with advocacy groups in the community who really understand the different populations and what's going on with them? Are you inviting them to the decision-making table? Are they helping you frame and provide input into what you're doing and how you could do things differently? So all of those are really important. And if you have groups like, you know, this group that's hosting us right now, where they're coming together, they're talking about what it's like to be an employee at UFT from different perspectives. How can we be more inclusive? You know, what would make a difference for us? They need to be at decision-making tables that are making decisions about hiring and about extending contracts and about you know, what promotion looks like and about, like, they shouldn't be having this conversation separately and not being invited to help make decisions because they are doing all the work to figure out what the organization needs, right? The other one is vendors. So I'll give you the example of CIBC. So there's something called a VPAT, and that's now I'm talking accessibility. So every corporation has business requirements. If you're a bank, for example, any financial institution, any big corporation will have specific business requirements that they have written up by technical specialists. Those business requirements take into account, you know, what are the codes and what are the compliance requirements from a legislation perspective, and then over and above that, what do we want to do based on our organizational values? And so when I was working at CIBC, we were looking at creating business requirements around accessibility. And one of the components that we were looking at was our suppliers. So if somebody like Microsoft or IBM is providing, you know, and they're spending millions of dollars, right? CIBC would be spending millions of dollars on any kind of solution that they want to roll out to everybody, whether it's a certain app or a certain type of laptop or a certain type of printers. Like, imagine how much they're spending with their vendors. But one thing that they hadn't done until I came into the picture and we started talking about it more was looking at VPATs. And a VPAT is a voluntary accessibility assessment of a technology or a piece. So if a vendor is saying to you, I would like, you know, I'm offering you this laptop, it solves all your problems. We're now asking them, can you also do an assessment from an accessibility perspective on this product that you're selling to us? So we understand, is it fully accessible? If it isn't accessible for certain groups of people, what are the solutions that you're offering as part of your contract with us, so that it's not an afterthought? So we as purchasers of things that people are giving to us as vendors and communities have a huge role to play. Same thing with Ontario Power Generation. I was working with Ontario Power Generation a couple of weeks ago on an interactive workshop, and we had the same conversation. They said one of the issues that staff are facing is that women have smaller hands and smaller heads and smaller feet, and they're having a really hard time finding gear that fits women's hands, heads, and feet. So what's happening is women are going and buying whatever is available, and it's either not the right standard so that it fits, or it's the right standard, but it's too big. So they're wearing shoes that are too big for them. They're wearing helmets that don't fit properly. And this is dangerous, right? From a safety and health occupational safety perspective. So what we came up with in our session together was, why don't we put requirements for all vendors who are providing hats, gloves, shoes, that they need to include these sizes that we need for our staff, or we're not going to do business with you. So that's a way to bring EDI into our relationship with vendors. And the last thing I want to talk about is supplier diversity. Supplier diversity is something you may or may not have heard of yet. It is really a big deal, and it is growing in Canada. And when we're talking about supplier diversity, we're talking about going out there and working with women-owned businesses, Indigenous-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, you know, people of different backgrounds who are creating products that are really amazing. And Walmart received an award a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago, for doing amazing work to proactively develop women-owned businesses and then buy from them. So now they're part of their supply chain. I think it was like almost $1 million of business was done in one day, where they brought women-owned businesses together and said, show us what you want us to stock on our shelves. So they trained them on how to sell to corporations, and then they sat down with them. They had 40 different people who buy for Walmart, and then they said, show us your product. And then $1 million worth of contracts happened right there. So really important that we start looking at supplier diversity. So for example, small organizations, one thing they're doing is when they order food in for their events, let's say they're doing a gender training or they're doing an EDI conference or whatever, they don't go to the big you know, chains like Whole Foods or Metro and say, you know, we want food for 100 people. They go find that Iranian woman who's cooking out of her house and who has amazing food and needs the income and support. And they're starting to make decisions about supporting supplier diversity in their events and in their just in how they do things. It doesn't take a lot, right? But it can be really amazing when you're being intentional. So here we are. I've rushed us through all 11 points. I'm sure there are other points you would want to add to this 11-point framework. I'd love to hear if there are. What I wanted to give you was a tiny taste of what it looks like to have a comprehensive framework and a really systematic approach to doing EDI work in your organization. And at minimum, I'm hoping that I have an aha moment around one of these. You have something that you can take back to your organization and say, let's look at our materials, or let's look at our supplier diversity, or let's, you know, get some feedback back to our HR, or let's create an ombudsman. You know, there's so many ways in which you can do EDI work right. And the key message here is it's not a cookie cutter approach, and it's not a 1 day, 1 year, 1 month project. This is an ongoing thing that requires a lot of support, not just from EDI experts, but from everybody. So I'm going to leave it there. We have about 15 minutes. And Ramya, I'm just going to ask you, I'm not going to do this, but do you want to look through the questions and just like invite people to speak, and then we can have a quick chat, 15 minutes?
Hi, Karen. Yes, I think in the interest of time, let's take up 1 or 2 chat questions.
Yeah.
One from Leela Shahid. Leela, are you ready to speak?
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Actually, part of the question Karen already asked, but I'll just go back to the other part that was there. First of all, thank you so much, Karen. This was honestly, like, I'm stunned. This was fantastic.
Aww.
This is amazing. So my question was, quickly being mindful of time, going back to it. So how important is it to have job descriptions for EDI work, where an essential requirement is to have EDI work experience, education, and engagement experience? You answered that part, that it is indeed very important, and specifically, you know, coming at it from certain organizational or, you know, government context, it's often not in place. So I think that's an important reinforcement. And the second part was, in addition, how do we integrate lived experience into job descriptions? while sounding, you know, again, this is like quote unquote politically correct. I know that some unions and labor progressive organizations, they do that, where they will say explicitly, if it is, say, for a women's and human rights coordinator, they will say preference will be given to women or you know, people of color and or LGBTQ people, or depending on the role, if it's like a racial engagement coordinator, they'll say preference given to people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color. So how may we do that with more mainstream employers? Thanks.
Yeah, I think so. One thing is how we write the job descriptions, as I said. I think it's really, well, let me just answer both questions again. So first of all, anyone doing EDI work should have a good job description. Anyone hired to do that work should have qualifications and know what they're doing. If they don't, if they're unsure, they need to talk to me so we can get you skilled up. The second question around hiring with lived experiences in mind is so important, because look, just recently I've had people say to me, I would have hired this woman, but I looked at her resume and she had like a 5-year gap. That looks suspicious. And it's like, yeah, because she was raising kids, you know? And honestly, like, if you ask me, I've learned so much in terms of time management, multitasking, like all kinds of skills by being a mother, but we don't recognize and we don't support and we don't validate these life opportunities that we have to develop ourselves when we take breaks, right? And so it really comes down to having conversations with our hiring team, not only in terms of what is the language that we're using. So I've actually seen job descriptions that have very little. They actually have very little in terms of formal requirements. And what they say is, you know, write us a letter, explain to us why you are the best person for this job. Tell us how your lived experience, how your positionality, and how your vision and perspective will bring something to this that we wouldn't normally get to hear from you about, because, you know, we said you need a master's degree. So I'm seeing companies are reducing the formal education requirement, and they're inviting people to share more about themselves up front, and they're selecting differently. I actually have one organization that I'm partnering with right now where their whole thing is, if you don't see a job for yourself, like if you want to work with us and you don't see a specific job that fits with your specific requirement, like let's say you're a technical person, but there isn't a technical job, but you want to work with us, reach out and tell us about who you are and what you're offering, and we will figure out if there's a fit for you. So more and more tech companies are being innovative, and I think it's not about tech, it's about being a younger generation who understands the complexity of life experience and who's willing to do things differently and break away from old bureaucratic ways of doing things, right? And I think everybody can do that in some form or shape or other. Okay, great question. Any more? Rami, are we picking someone else? If you want to speak, do you want to put your hand up? Maybe we can take one or two more. I'm not seeing much in the chat right now. Oh wait, there was Q&A. Okay, let's go back to the Q&A then. So one question that Catalina had was around organizational culture and how do you address resistance? Any resources or best practices? Okay, awesome. Okay, okay. So let's talk about resistance, because that is a key part of doing EDI work, okay? And it's very much a part of my positionality on this as well. So anytime you're dealing with EDI work, racial equity, gender equality, accessibility, any of those things, you are dealing with a very sensitive issue that people take personally because it is personal, right? Like, it is personal. If you have ever been passed over on a promotion because you weren't the right skin color, if you have ever you know, been made to wait while somebody else is served because you didn't look right, if you've had any of those experiences, and we've asked for you to share those experiences with us on ThoughtExchange, so you can go back and do that even after the seminar, after the webinar. But if you've ever experienced any kind of othering, then you know that this work is deeply personal, that it's not just about filling in a policy or checking a box. And I think when, you know, one of the reasons why we have resistance is because people see it as a bureaucratic process, not understanding how deeply personal this work is because they haven't experienced it. They haven't gone through it themselves. And so I have a lot of the resistance that I've seen is from people who, for example, people who will say to me, oh, great, so now because of this EDI requirement, you know, I'm the one who's being discriminated against because I'm a young white male and I fit, you know, I fill in all the boxes of the bad guy. I'm not a bad guy, but because of all the quota and all the focus on, you know, equity groups and all of this stuff, I'm losing my opportunity to have this job when I should. And so part of the resistance is coming from a place of how we understand power. So a lot of people understand power as zero sum, which means either I have it or you have it. We can't both have it, right? And so part of the work that we need to do is to help reframe power dynamics and reframe understanding of power from one of either I have it or you have it to let's all benefit from what we're doing, right? So educating around that is really important. The other thing I'll say about resistance, and I faced it in so many ways. So one thing I'll say is I see resistance as an invitation to be engaged because I want to have a say in what's happening. People feel resistant when they feel like they have no say. They're losing power. And I've actually had a lot of friends, you know, I'll just be really honest. Like I've had white people write to me, friends, really good friends of mine, and they say, you know, somebody was on an article making some comments, and then all of a sudden, all the black people in their community wrote and said, yeah, you see, Meghan Markle was pushed out of the monarchy because it's a racist monarchy. And then this white person who's a friend of mine said, well, you know, you're not giving credit to the Queen because the Queen actually, like imagine what she did to go out of her way to break the monarchy's way of doing things, to welcome Meghan into the royal family. Like imagine what it took for her to do that. Meanwhile, everybody's saying the monarchy is racist, right? And so here's my thing on racism, and not racism, but here's my thing on resistance. I see resistance as an elephant. And if you've ever heard the story of 3 blind men and an elephant, you know, somebody asks 3 blind men, what is an elephant? And one blind man reaches out and says, oh, an elephant is like a snake. It's long and windy because of the tail. Another one says, oh, an elephant is like a trunk. It's like a tree trunk because of the legs. And another one says, oh, an elephant is like rubbery and, you know, it feels like a bat's wings because of the ears. And the truth is that everybody is right. They're not all fully right, but their experience of what's happening has some element of truth in it. And one way to deal with resistance is to look for the truth in our experiences. So if I have someone saying to me, you know, you've really offended me, whether or not I intended to, if I offended that person, I have to start with where they're at. I have to start with acknowledging that I can see how, from your perspective, where you're standing, it would feel that way. And then partner with them on helping them move from where they are to where I want to go with them, right? So I'm just going to stop there on the resistance thing and say it's a very complicated question. It's one that I deal with. I have a whole module on dealing with resistance, different types of resistance, different strategies for dealing with resistance as part of my online program. But at the end of the day, for me, the thing that makes me so successful is that I'm really compassionate. And where I'm coming from when I'm dealing with people, whether it's white people or black people or brown people or immigrants or refugees or, you know, people from Africa who I love because I'm African, like where I'm coming from is a place of compassion. When people are showing resistance, we need to learn to let our guards down and be really, really compassionate and like, stop trying to find excuses and stop trying to push them back and just listen to what their concerns are. Because often there's an element of truth in what they're concerned about. And they want to be heard as much as we want to be heard. But you're not going to have someone, you know, walk 2 steps forward towards you if you're not even willing to be open to what they have to say. So that would be my thing about resistance is it's complicated. There are strategies, But at the end of the day, it comes down to your way of being with someone who's struggling. And your way of being should be compassionate, open, should I say loving, because that's really important to me, is that we look at this work as an opportunity for us to develop relationships, to be loving towards each other, and to really model what it is we're committed to in the world, right? So many people doing EDI work are frustrated, they're angry, they're bitter, they're feeling like the world is an unjust and unfair place. That's all true. But it's also true that we have white people who are trying to help people of color. It's also true that we have able-bodied people who are going out of their way to find ways to make buildings and services accessible. It's also true that we have heterogeneous people who are trying to create inclusive spaces for trans people. So like, so important that we frame this work and model what it is that we want the world to give us, which is love, compassion, understanding, right? Because you're not going to change someone's mind when you're coming at them with anything else. So I'll just stop there and let Ramya wrap up maybe, so we're on time.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to start my screen. Is everyone able to see my slide deck? I guess you're just not seeing me. All right, there we go. Yeah, so I'm back. So thank you so much, Karen. I truly appreciate your time putting this together for us. I would also like to take a few moments to close the event and thank our participants. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Karen, for your time putting this together. And I would like to say a big thank you for the team that might have been stayed invisible behind the background, without whom I wouldn't be able to host this. So thank you, Jermaine Ingram from INITS, Martina Douglas from the EDO office, Rachel Kulik from the Historical Studies, Rebecca Mahadio from International Education Center, and Stephanie Santos from Language Studies. We are all members of the UTM CNC Executive Committee. And we also want to thank the UFD HR and Equity Office, in particular the Anti-Racism Cultural Diversity Office, the UTM EDO Office, and the UTM HR Office for making this possible and supporting our team operationally, so we can, through our affinity group, offer webinars like this and have conversations like this within our groups, but also broader like we have done today. Before we close entirely, I would just like to remind everyone about next steps. So you'll receive an email with a link to a survey, as well as a thought exchange that Karen would really enjoy looking at your feedback and your takeaways. So look out for that. We have a recording of this webinar that we will edit and then send out to participants. So you can review that if you've missed anything. And last but not least, please stay connected. And here are some ways for you to stay connected. So Karen is our facilitator today. She's from Conscious Equality, Inc. And her social media handling are down there, as well as connections and conversations. As you remember, we're the affinity group for racialized staff and their supporters at U of T. We're your host today, and you can reach us on our website, or feel free to email me and I will connect you to one of the executives. Please also sign up for the CNC listserv on the UTM website. That's available on our link above. We have also created a LinkedIn group, so all the UTM staff members who have joined and have not been out to any of our events, we will be tentatively scheduling more online and virtual opportunities. We also have some upcoming virtual coffee chats that are tri-campus for CNC members, but anyone is welcome. So the next meetups will be April 6th, 15th, and the 20th. We have Microsoft Teams, which you should all have access to. If there's any questions about those and you'd like me to assist you with that, let me know and I'll be happy to do that. So thank you again, everyone. This brings us to the close of our events. Karen has graciously offered to connect with you individually. The survey that gives you an opportunity to leave your email address if you wish to do so. So thank you, everyone. So I will close our event with this. A big round of applause virtually for Karen and all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And reach out on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn too. Thanks, everyone.